In our world, technology is hope and the internet has a solution for almost every problem. And it shapes everything around us. So, for the longest time, big tech companies have been the perfect blue-eyed boys. They've been shaping economies, helping governments evolve, doing relief work in disaster-struck countries. Let's just take a moment to remember how important they were to us during the COVID-19 pandemic.
These companies have given us access to things, to ideas that would have otherwise been out of reach for most of us. 5 companies. That is how small this group is. But together, they are connected to half of the world's population. We are talking about Apple, Google, Amazon, Meta, and Microsoft. These are the companies that hold the very foundation on which so much of tech innovation is built and is being built around the world.
And the more we relied on them, the more control we gave them. And now, we have reached a point where these big tech companies are often more powerful than many national governments. They have become the giant in our garden. Only this time, instead of keeping the children out by building a high wall, the giant is saying, "Come play in my lovely garden. But I'll also build a wall to make sure you never get out, and I also get to decide exactly the kind of information that'll come to you from the other side of the wall."
But here's the thing, as the giant grew bigger and more powerful, all of us became a little wary. We became concerned about things like privacy, security, misinformation. And at the same time, the small fish in the tech pond wanted more space to breathe. We all started thinking, has big tech just become a little too big?
And you know what that means? It means that the giant's wall has finally cracked. These 5 companies have been facing an onslaught of antitrust lawsuits all over. And in all of them, they are being accused of abusing their dominance in some way or the other, of basically being monopolistic. This anti-big tech sentiment that started in the West has spread everywhere. And the more we probe into these allegations, the uglier the picture that emerges.
This morning, we're taking a look at a landmark court ruling that could change the way that you use the internet.
We begin today's show with what's being described as the biggest antitrust case of the 21st century. On Monday, a federal judge ruled Google has illegally maintained a monopoly over the internet search market.
Google controls more than 90% of the online search market. The U.S. Justice Department says the company maintains a monopoly by paying billions of dollars to device makers and telecommunications companies.
Judge Amit Mehta of the U.S. District Court of Columbia delivered a landmark verdict last month. Finally, the Google monopoly had been challenged. But what does that mean for the rest of the world? What does that mean for us? In this episode, we were joined by Manjushree RM, a resident fellow at Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, to understand this pushback against big tech, whether it's gone too far, and how India is keeping up with it all.
Hello and welcome to another special episode of Daybreak. I'm Snigdha.
And I'm Rahil, and every week we come together to talk about something in business and tech that interests the both of us.
And it won't just be us. Depending on what we're talking about, we will bring a bunch of really interesting people onto the podcast.
Hi, Manju. Welcome to Daybreak.
Thank you, Rahil. Thank you, Snigdha. It's great to be
Thank you
speaking
so much
with you
for
guys.
joining us.
We're really excited to have this conversation with you because there are very few people who are as well placed as you are, to talk about the world's biggest technology companies, Google, Meta, Apple, Amazon, and the kind of pushback that they're facing right now, right? And what that means for all of us as people who engage with these companies in some way or the other, very often in ways that we don't even know about on a day-to-day basis, right? And I say that because Manju has worked very closely with the committee that worked on the draft digital competition bill in India.
Right.
And of course, we're going to get into her work there in a little bit. We're going to talk about, how India plans to regulate, how India plans to look at antitrust regulations, when it comes to big tech very soon. But before we get to that, we have a slightly more fundamental question. Right? We want to know why everyone is talking about antitrust and big tech right now, and where antitrust actually fits in when it comes to regulating big tech.
Right. So, that's a great question to start with, because the way we've looked at competition or antitrust in India is just limited to the Competition Act 2002. So, which, for a lot of us just looks like any other legislation, right? So, what does it really mean when we're talking about competition versus when we're talking about regulation at large? So, let's really try and draw this out as a spectrum, right? Like, on the one hand, you have laissez-faire, where you look at a situation where the government absolutely does not intervene in the way markets work. And on the other end of the spectrum is something similar to a license Raj, where before every step, you need to take the government's permission, right? Competition fits somewhere in between, where we're saying that let's have a slightly more balanced approach to regulation, because there are benefits to both the government being slightly involved and letting markets work the way they naturally do. So it's a little like, let's take a playground example, right? So laissez-faire would be a situation where you let a bunch of kids come into the playground and, allow them to play without there being any rules about who gets how much time on the swing or on the slide. You will naturally see that the big bully kids will start bullying everybody else out, the smaller kids out. And it is pretty much that, right? Like in that and they will get all the swing time, they will play on the best, things on the playground, and the smaller kids will just be waiting, in the background. On the other hand, if you have complete regulation, and that if you say that you have to fill in such a large form before you enter the playground every
Turn
time,
by turn, 5 minutes or whatever.
or just say that even before you enter into the playground, you have to tell me who you are, where you're residing, who your mom is, who your dad is. All of this essentially means that the number of kids that will voluntarily want to play will automatically go down. So now, what is the solution, right, to something like this? So the idea then would be to have a game where there are some rules, but we don't take the enjoyment out of the game, but we just tell kids how to play this game, right? And then we have umpires, which are largely like the antitrust regulators. That's what they're supposed to do, in that they're just supposed to observe that the rules of the game are being followed fairly, but you let kids decide how to creatively meander around those rules and play the game really, because that's when the best of both worlds come out. So antitrust is a little like that. You set the rules of the game to ensure that it's fair, it's competitive, and everybody gets a fair chance to do it. But this comes again with a huge presumption when we're talking about, situating competition at the center of laissez-faire and a complete regulation, that some amount of competition is always good in a market. Now, but that's an assumption, right? We might want to get to that later, because there are some markets that behave like natural monopolies. I mean, natural monopolies are basically markets where there is a single entrant, where the entry barrier to set up a business is so high that it actually doesn't make sense for a second competitor to imitate exactly what one person is doing. So, in a natural monopoly, you have a situation where the way we would understand competition differs slightly, in that it's not competition for the sake of competition. So we'll park that for the moment and, move later. But largely, if I have to situate competition in the larger, broad theory of regulation, it's at somewhere between, laissez-faire and complete regulation.
Right. But Manju, whenever we speak of antitrust, there's this very important reason that comes up, right? Which is innovation. Like in an ideal market with the right kind of antitrust regulations in place, innovation will take place, and that is the sign of a healthy market. How true is this with respect to big tech?
So, for a long time, whenever we have intervened in cases where there has been, some amount of monopoly or some amount of market power that's concentrated with one single entity, the theory around this is that, I grow as a company, I get enough of a market share in that I'm making great profits, etc., etc. Then my incentive to innovate really falls, right? So then you need to have someone else in the market that keeps you on your toes so that you innovate better and you're able to, then offer better prices to consumer, more choice to consumer, and all of these are part of what we understand to be healthy competition in the market, right? But there is also a situation where this competition can become a little bit of an overdose. I mean, there is a brilliant book called Competition Overdose that I would, absolutely recommend the readers also to look at, where sometimes when the level of competition is so high that, it becomes very hard for competitors to keep up with the pressure of that competition, that standards often fall, right? So there is this famous case in the US that happened with the quality of meat, the quality, the kind of market competition from meat producers was so high that the quality of meat dropped so significantly because there was no way for them to compete on prices that the other person was offering without really dropping the quality of meat to the extent that they did. So this is where I think we'll have to first fundamentally ask the question, what is the goal of antitrust really, right? And I don't think we understand that fully well. We are, in the midst of articulating what the goals of antitrust for India means, hopefully, with more conversation on the draft digital competition bill, but it's not a straightforward answer really.
Got it.
That playground analogy that you just used was really interesting. And
Right.
I want to understand where, the Google verdict in the US recently kind of figures in that analogy, right? Just for context for our listeners, we know that there was this really landmark kind of Google verdict that happened just recently. We saw Justice Amit Mehta essentially say that Google's been acting illegally to maintain its monopoly. It's been paying the likes of Apple and Samsung billions of dollars to have Google automatically handle all of its search queries on their smartphones and their web browsers. And of course, this is the first significant antitrust ruling against big tech, in the recent wave of lawsuits that we've seen the world over, which is why it's being talked about considerably. All of this is great in theory, right? All of us are kind of in agreement that monopolies exist. Yes, to some degree, they have to be kept in check. Competition is a good thing to a certain extent. All of that is great. But I want to understand what the end game is, when it comes to antitrust lawsuits, especially like this one, right? Is the end game breaking the monopoly, which I think we've established by now isn't likely because of regulation, because of lawsuits? Is it giving people more choice? Because in my opinion, if we're talking about Google in particular, people are still going to be using Google search.
Absolutely.
Right? It's not
Absolutely.
like people are magically after the verdict going to start using Bing more or using DuckDuckGo more.
Yeah.
Right? And that's kind of along the lines of Google's defense in this whole thing as well, where they just said, you know what, we do search better and that's why people use us. So what really changes?
So that's a lot of questions rolled into one. And let's take them one at a time. So just contextualizing the US ruling recently, a couple of things. One, the remedies hearing is yet to happen, and that this was so usually this is a federal court sort of a judgment, and there is what the remedy for Google's conduct is going to be is not out yet. So it's supposed to start on the 6th. That's tomorrow. Yeah. So when the episode drops, I think the readers will have a little more of context to understand why the remedies went a certain way. But I think, at least from what I've been reading around in newspapers, there are many ways to look at remedies. I don't think breaking up Google is completely off the table yet, but we don't know what's going to, what the final agreement that the DOJ and the courts, here really arrive at. And second, most importantly, this is still a federal court judgment, and Google has very much, publicly stated that it will appeal this order. So we are yet to see how this will, play out in the future. So I think let's take the Google judgment with a degree of a little less. I mean, it's a little more uncertain and not as final as we'd like it to be at this point in time. And let's sort of keep that at the back of our minds when we're talking about the Google judgment, because I have a feeling that there is a lot that's going to generally change around this, because there is, again, when we look at Google's defense in this case, right, the thing that Google said about, hey, I am dominant because I am just doing this better than everyone else. And to prove the counterfactual in this case has been very difficult, right? Like, if you look at the kinds of people that, the kinds of entities that Google entered into these agreements are other arguably big tech companies like Samsung and Apple, who, if they thought was a good business opportunity to have another search engine, they would have by now, right? This somewhere brings me to the heart of the question that you try to tie this with the playground example, right? Like, that the playground example is great when we have, we understand somewhere competition as something that relates to the overall health of the market and not really competition for the sake of competition. In that, in this whole Google thing, I am not really certain that if there is going to be an as efficient a competitor that we're trying to protect, that I don't see a single situation of, hey, there would be someone else that would have made it as big as Google did if not for these agreements. I don't think I'm seeing that very clearly because if you think of Apple, right, like Apple is so hell-bent on giving the best to its consumers that for Apple, it makes complete sense to push Google as a default sort of search engine on its consumers as opposed to anybody else, because Apple has internally vetted and verified that Google is what is best on the market. So who are we really trying to protect? And exactly.
Even from the consumer's perspective, right? Like we use an Apple phone and we have Google as the default search engine. I know it's the best. My phone is the best. My search engine is the best. Why do I even want a choice?
So who does it serve really?
Right. And I think that's a broader debate that we have to answer here, Rahil, in that I don't think we have... So earlier, right, like let's go back a little bit to the theory of how antitrust evolved. So earlier we started with this whole idea that big is bad, in that, anyone that accumulates power, hey, we have to be very wary. Look, they are so powerful. They might do something tomorrow to abuse it. And then we realized that, if we start with this whole idea of big is bad, then in some ways you are preventing or disincentivizing companies from getting big in the first place. Because the moment you hit that threshold, I'm saying that, you invest all of that money and become a great search engine. Hey, now that you're big, I'm really going to come clamping down on you. And that's not the precedent that we want to set, right? But that's... Again, in some ways, that is the sort of antitrust, that was the flavor of the season when we were looking at antitrust a little earlier back, which is the Harvard School of Thought generally. And from there, we've moved on to what is perhaps the Chicago School of Thought, where we're sort of trying to understand, big is not bad, but abuse of big power is bad, right? So what is problematic is that if there is abuse. And traditionally, what is abuse has always been looked at vis-a-vis the consumer. But to make a case of abuse in competition terms, when we look at digital markets, is a very tricky, problem. And we've just about been able to articulate why, digital markets are an antitrust concern separately from there being, privacy concerns. Because when a consumer is getting products or services free of cost, right? And all of your antitrust is centered on price theory, in that it has to mean lower prices for customers. It has to mean more choice for customers. And so much of it is centered around price as a fundamental theory that when you're getting services for free of cost, you automatically want to ask yourself, can it get any better? Not really, should we do something to regulate it, or should we do something to break up the monopoly that Google has?
Okay, so then what are the sort of implications of the search engine case, for general users like us and also for Google?
So let's look a little bit at, Google's business model as a whole. How does Google really make money? A lot of its revenue comes from advertisements. And that's because for it to maintain a powerful search engine as the one that Google has become the default word for search. It's like Xerox and photocopy. I don't think people say photocopying as much as they say Xerox. And we immediately say, if you want to search for something, you say Google it, not search it, right? So the way Google has established that, one, maybe trust, maybe that presence in the market, and the fact that it takes tons of money and maintenance and resources to run something as powerful as a search engine that Google does, means that it has to be monetized in some fashion or the other. Right? So if you're hitting on the heart of advertisement, then is the implication that tomorrow, if Google's search and advertisements are completely split up as services, would consumers tomorrow be happy with paying some money for Google search? I'm not sure, that's the sort of outcome that we're looking at, right? So then what is the remedy that's going to come out? I mean, even I'm waiting to see what the remedy phase of this case is going to look like. But the implications of this on consumer, especially for me at least, is unclear. And this also ties in with a little bit about what sort of a test, the court relied on in this case. Is this brown shoe sort of a test that was, earlier used in one historical merger that was very, very criticized for, because the criticism there was, even though the merger would mean less prices for consumers, they said that this is anti-competitive because, right? It was a because. It stopped there. And we've relied on this exact precedent to hold Google as a monopolist, and the fact that it was abusing its monopoly in one market to enter advertising and do the kind of exclusive agreements that it had. But the fundamental point that I'm trying to make here is that all of these new waves of trying to regulate antitrust may take away significantly from the benefits that it has to consumers, and that's something that we ought to be quite cautious about.
Okay, again, in an ideal world, if big tech is kept in check and, smaller companies are allowed to flourish, what does that mean for users like us? Like, going back to what we were speaking about earlier, like Google and Apple together are great user experience, right? So what happens when smaller players come into the picture?
So, that again, Snigdha hits at a very fundamental question, in that if not Google, what else would the market look like?
Yeah.
And I don't think we have
Sounds
an
very
answer.
familiar to Indians, no?
Yeah.
If not XYZ, then who?
Yeah, but because today it's very difficult to imagine Google as a service alone, and I think it's perhaps best characterized as an infrastructure where a lot of other small companies are building things on top of Google. So it's giving giving a lot of. So let's take Amazon, for example, right? Like I do agree that there may be things that are anti-competitive that we have to look at with Amazon, like such as self-preferencing, what it does with Solimo, etc., etc. But the fact that, it has established access for e-commerce to some of the remotest parts of the country is not something that we want to ignore, or even Google for that matter. At the end of the day, if search and YouTube and communication is available to villages in India, and if Google is doing that for free, it might be somewhere problematic to say that my vision of consumer welfare does not account for those that are reliant on Google in a way where, choice is not their primary concern, but access is.
Absolutely.
So I don't think that that's a narrative that we have completely articulated as a country yet. In that, I think our flavor for really what should we do with big tech companies has largely been inspired from what's happening in the EU, but EU and India are very, very differently situated.
Actually, this is a good time, right, Manju, to look at how the Indian legal system has been dealing with monopolies and the latest antitrust draft bill that you worked on.
Right.
And, we all know that it is inspired by the EU antitrust law, the EU Digital Markets Act.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about why was it a good framework to follow the EU law?
Right. So there are a couple of reasons for this, right? So one, when we generally talk about tech regulation, there is something called the Brussels effect, where EU generally sets the standards for what tech regulation for the, it has the first beginner's move advantage in, coming out with a sort of law that needs to be followed. And because a lot of companies end up complying with those laws to make it suitable for EU, it's easier for other countries to also put similar compliance mechanisms in place so that, it gets easier for companies to not have to think about many different regulations. That's one side of it. The second part of it is that there are two technical, perhaps, phrases that I will throw around a little bit, and I'm happy to break them down further. So there is one called, India. Again, let's be very wary of the fact that our regulatory capacity is very, very different from how it is in the EU, right?
Yeah.
So the way the CCI works is very, very different from how the EC works or how the DOJ, FTC, and the court systems work in the US. And our legal systems are the kind of appeals that we have pending at the NCLAT, the kind of appeals we have pending at the Supreme Court, etc. It's clear that there is a logjam and a clogging problem in our judiciary that's very different from the way it is in the EU and US. So let's just keep that in mind, for a little while. And third, so ultimately, when we're talking about big tech regulation, it's been fairly clear that the kind of anti-competitive practices that we're seeing across the world are somehow similar, right? Like the kind of cases that we're seeing in the EU, the kind of cases we're seeing in the US, the kind of problems that we're seeing in India are somewhere similar. So if there is someone in the ecosystem and as a regulator that's gotten a law right, perhaps, then there is no shame in getting inspired from that. But at the same time, this inspiration should be very attuned to Indian political realities, right? So
Exactly.
one of the reasons why we've always tried to be inspired by EU laws, it also comes from the fact that our Competition Act 2002 was largely inspired from the European, the TFEU, which is the European Union's competition law, and the UK competition law. So, and because we're a common law country, in some ways, we've also found it easier to rely on EU and UK precedents as opposed to the US largely. So that's one of the reasons as to why we've looked at EU generally. Second, the EU's DMA generally. Another reason perhaps that I could think of why we've looked at the EU more specifically than any other country that has tried to do something around antitrust is the fact that when the committee sat down for its deliberations, which was last year, Feb 2023, the only law that was completely in shape, ready to be enforced, was the DMA. So a lot of this was also the timing at which India decided to take cognizance of whatever is happening in Indian digital ecosystem, and to see if competition could be a tool to sort of try and tinker around that to establish a more fairer, competitive digital ecosystem. So these are largely the reasons why we decided
But
to
why
take
not
inspiration.
strengthen the existing competition law? Why introduce a whole new law to cater specifically to digital markets?
Yeah, so this comes down to something called, Exante versus Expost regulation, right? So, and again, the line between Exante and Expost isn't really clear. So, generally, when we've looked at, the larger theory of competition, where we situated competition in between laissez-faire and pure regulation, is that we want competition to be as light touch as possible, in that I will only intervene when something goes wrong.
Right.
So, general competition theory has said that if you have to make a trade-off between slightly being slightly over-regulatory versus slightly under-regulatory, let's try and veer towards under-regulation, because the cost of over-regulation on markets is very, very harsh. Now, in digital markets, however, there is ongoing debate that this error cost may not work in the same way as it does with traditional markets, because by the time you take when you take a case of a Google or an Amazon, by the time you sort of get them to the CCI, establish that they have a dominance, go ahead and check their abuse and come out with a ruling, you're talking about a good 3-year, 4-year, perhaps a 7-year window. The Google shopping case in EU went on for 7 years. So by the time the decision is out, the markets would have moved so swiftly that the competitors that were trying to compete would have naturally been pushed out of the market. So there we're trying to do something called ex-ante regulation, which is trying to regulate preemptively as opposed to in a post-facto fashion. So to try and, draw the playground analogy, ex-ante regulation would be trying to set the rules of the game, but ex-post regulation would be to be an umpire of the said game. So an umpire checks in on you, or the umpire will have to only decide on a case-to-case basis if there's been a violation or there's a problem, if someone's done some foul, and call foul at that point
And
in time.
India so far has been the umpire.
But how would it work? Like, are you literally talking about big tech companies like a lot more paperwork for them, where you have to apply for absolutely everything? And how does that actually work in practice?
So that's a great question, Rahil, because DMA is the only act that's been in force that is purely an ex-ante competition law till now, and it has had its own teething problems. I mean, we've been reading up about how the compliance costs for companies have generally shot up. And especially compliance costs is far more heavier on the smaller ones than the bigger ones, if the thresholds for who should notify aren't perfectly calibrated, right? Like, because your ex-ante might be what prevents someone that is about to compete with the big guy that gets clamped down upon, because there is a huge amount of regulatory cost that the this company has to now bear with. So yes, unfortunately, the way we have sort of looked at ex-ante regulation under the DMA involves a fair bit of paperwork, and I imagine it to be somewhere similar, even if the draft TCB, the way it is currently in shape, comes to see the light of the day. But I do think there is a lot more scope for to shape the public narrative around what this digital competition bill should look like. Because I think at the end of the day, it starts a very important conversation. Hey, something is wrong here. I see smoke, and that smoke may not be without fire. So it's worthwhile to look into where that fire is coming from. But whether we want to, if it's a small fire, whether it really makes sense for us to go just maybe with a tiny extinguisher, or do we want to take, call the fire brigade, is a question on the degree of regulation that we want to, subject these entities
So Manju, tell us about this draft bill.
Right.
Yeah. Like what are the major fundamental changes? Because now it's come in almost 30 years after the 2002 law, right?
Right.
Why did it take so long? And what were the important parts that were missing in that you're trying to make up for it in this bill?
Couple of things. So again, let's sort of roll back a little bit and think about lawmaking in general, right? So lawmaking and enforcement, if I were to compare that to how businesses are run, lawmaking is usually the idea stage of a business, and the enforcement is running the business. So in my limited knowledge in terms of how lawmaking and enforcement happens, I think lawmaking is perhaps the easier part. Getting the idea for a business is perhaps the easier part. The enforcement is what's really tricky. Keeping your business running is also what's going to take, is going to sweat out the entrepreneurs more than the idea itself, right? So one thing about let's sort of keep that in mind here, because when we're talking about why we are coming to an ex-ante regulation perhaps 30 years after the Competition Act that came into picture in 2022, although it was only enforced much later. I think it began enforcement only in 2012 because there was a bunch of litigation that stopped the CCI.
10 years after?
Yeah. 10 years after. So there was this Brahmadat case and a bunch of other cases that challenged the CCI's powers itself, because the CCI was doing the fact-finding, was also has quasi-judicial powers, was also,
judge, jury, execution.
Exactly. So it's at the end of the day, there was a little bit, it is an expert body, so it has all of these, functions rolled up into one. So there was a lot of litigation around whether that's fair, whether that violates principles of natural justice, etc., and the CCI only started functioning, much later. Now, so we moved not from so let's talk about this a little more historically, because before the Competition Act, we had the MRTP Act, right? So the MRTP Act was a pre-liberalization act. We realized that what we wanted to only clamp down was on things that were monopolies and not essentially other anti-competitive practices such as whether vertical agreements or abuse of dominance or cartels, which are largely in the new Competition Act 2002. Now, it took us a while to get from MRTP to Competition Act, and all this while we were largely dealing with traditional markets. So if you see CCI's decisions under the Competition Act 2002, some of the most important decisions that it's had has been in things like cement factories or automotive industry, etc. And the first principles around the Competition Act 2002 was also drawn up keeping those markets in mind. It's not really a legislation that had the foresight to think about digital competition, digital market as it exists today. But that's true of any regulator that you look at, which is why, although there is a TFEU, EU came out with the Digital Markets Act, right? The US has also been talking about coming up with a host of new bills, everything from the CHIPS Act to IOCA to everything that talks about, that specifically aims at establishing a fair, competitive, field, different from the fact that there exists a Sherman and a Clayton Act separately, right? So the fundamental point of this is that our old competition regimes didn't really account for the way digital markets would evolve and the way they stand today. So there is some sort of a consensus that is emerging that we may have to look at this, with a fresh pair of eyes. So, which is why there is a fresh bill, the Digital Competition Bill, that tries to look at this. Now, this establishes the fact here that there is perhaps a need to look at digital markets differently. There is perhaps a merit in entertaining how ex-ante regulation could be helpful in establishing a competitive digital ecosystem. But whether we want to completely go by the DMA model or not is a completely different question from, whether we want ex-ante regulation or not. Because let's sort of like look at how India's ecosystem is sort of like, poised. For every Amazon, you have a Flipkart that's competing. You have our own homegrown tech giants such as Swiggy, Zomato. An Ola competes head to head with
Uber.
like an Uber. There is now Rapido. There is Namayatri. So clearly, in some pockets of our economy, it is not as concentrated as we'd like to believe, or it is not definitely as concentrated as it is in the EU or the US. There are definitely some parts of Indian economy that I do believe that there is some dominance. A couple of Google cases that have come up before the CCI has looked at in the context of App Store, has looked at in the context of Android. So some places there is clear monopoly, like a clear, I think somewhere in the 94 or 97% of the Google's, the search market is dominated by Google. So that's a huge number, right? So, but this may not be the problem when you look at, say, a Swiggy or Amazon versus a Flipkart. And more importantly, newer innovations such as Blinkit or these quick commerce delivery services are taking on these Amazon and e-commerce giants very, very strongly. So there is clearly evidence that the market still allows for competitors to come up, at least in certain pockets of the economy. So a fundamental question that we have to ask here is, one, do we need ex-ante regulation? And if the answer to that is yes, the second question that we ought to ask is, in what limited spheres of the digital market is ex-ante regulation advisable?
Because it could end up being counterproductive in that sense, right? Because then everyone's the big guy.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And then the same rules that apply to a Google or an Amazon or someone else will also apply to a Flipkart and like people who are actually emerging as challengers to these massive companies in India.
Absolutely. And in fact, it has the opposite effect of, if you want competition to emerge from the market, regulation might be what is stifling that competition from emerging, as opposed to opening up doors for new competition. So I think we'll have to be careful about the heavy-handedness that regulation generally comes with. And I think there is this wonderful paper that, Shruti Rajgopalan and Alex Tabrock have sort of talked about, which is premature imitation in India when we talk about, regulation making, in that we tend to imitate what the West does, but somewhere that imitation in the process might lose, relevance in reality, because our situations might in fact be very, very different.
What you just said, the digital market in India is very different from the ones in the West. That makes sense.
Okay, so coming back to the bill, Manju, how do you identify the big guy? Like, who is the big guy?
Okay, so that's an interesting question again. So let's look at how we did it under the Competition Act, right? So we have something called dominance, which is also something that the EU uses as a standard. The US calls it monopoly power, but they all roughly mean the same thing, right? So dominance is basically the ability for you to single-handedly, sway the market in a way that it would make sense to you simply because you have the power to do that. It basically measures the degree of influence that you have on the market, right? Now, earlier, the way we did it is that we identified a relevant market, and then we asked the question as to, in this relevant market, who is the competitor for this entity? If there weren't many competitors, then we understood that entity to be dominant in that market. So this relevant market is a very important sort of a definition in that, a very important sort of an exercise, because, let's take the example of the Ken itself, right? So in some ways, Ken could be competing with Spotify, but it really depends on whether you classify Spotify as a music streaming service or a podcast streaming service, or whether you classify Ken as a newspaper and your news media company, or whether you classify it as a podcast streamer. So identifying in which market are you looking at the relative strength of that enterprise becomes very, very important, right? Now, to do this in digital markets has, however, become very difficult because all of these companies, right, leverage the way their business models are organized is that they don't, it is almost impractical as a business decision to only exist in one market and not another. So by virtue of how business models are organized, someone in search is going to invariably be there in advertisement. Someone that's going to be there in shopping is invariably going to also be a competitor on the same platform. So that's the only way where this model makes sense for businesses. Otherwise, you're essentially asking them to run certain infrastructural services free of cost. That's I don't think we think that's a fair outcome, right? So to do that under the digital so therefore to delineate exactly the sphere of operation of these big tech companies is very, very difficult, right? So which is why in the draft digital competition bill you have a list of core digital services at the schedule at the end of it, where we have everything from cloud services to online to app stores to search engines, etc., etc. So these are supposed to serve as proxies for your relevant market. Now, once you've identified the relevant market and you are someone that provides that particular core digital service, there are some financial thresholds and there are some user thresholds when looked together should be able to tell you whether you are an entity that satisfies those thresholds. And if you satisfy those thresholds, you can become designated as an SSD, a systemically significant digital enterprise, which is the rough equivalent of dominance that we looked at under the old Digital Competition Act. So under the new Digital Competition Bill, under the old Competition Act. So under the new Digital Competition Bill, we are calling that standard as an SSD standard. So you have, it's based on how much turnover you have, how much gross merchandise value you bring to the table, what your global market capitalization is, and also the number of users you have, how many business users you have, and how many end users you have. Now, one thing again to keep here in mind is, again, these thresholds are also largely borrowed from what is happening in the EU.
Okay.
Now, that's where I think the reluctance for a lot of industries and a lot of stakeholders have arisen, because these thresholds, yes, may catch the big fish in the pond, but the question that we ought to be asking is not that who it catches, but who else does it catch? Because that has far-reaching implications on the kind of innovation that we want to spur in our digital ecosystem. So we may very ostensibly be looking at a situation where, DMA has only designated 6 entities, if I'm not wrong, as gatekeepers. And these are all your big entities. You have your Google, you have your Meta, you have ByteDance, you have Booking.com. These are the large entities that have gotten caught under the net. But that net might be a little too, sparsely spread for the Indian context. And that may have implications for how our digital economy works.
Also, Manju, the ex-ante part, right? There's been a lot of resistance from tech companies in India. Can you tell us why?
Okay, so, I mean, if I were putting myself in their shoes, right, of course, any regulation is going to cost me a lot in terms of the way I organize my affairs. So I think some amount of resistance is expected whenever you're trying to roll out a new law, and the subjects of...
But at the same time, sorry to interrupt, but we saw 40 startups, Indian startups that came out and they were fully supporting the draft bill, right? But then you also had other companies who are opposing, especially the ex-ante, but
So, yes, so there is currently a little bit of a flux that the bill, is in, also because it's not a bill that's been put up as the ministry's bill, but it's largely in a recommendatory stage, and that the committee deliberated on it and has proposed a version that the MCA may or may not take up, right? So, at least under the thresholds so I think principally, when you look at ex-ante, I think a lot of smaller startups and a lot of, other innovators in the ecosystem think that this is something that's beneficial for them, because it's somehow going to help them somehow going to help the CCI rein in the really, really big guys. But that calibration, who are we really targeting, becomes very, very important. Because in an ideal world, we would be catching maybe 3 or 4 big tech guys, but in a not so ideal world, we may be catching somewhere around 40 or 50 of them, or at least asking them to come and notify that I fulfill these criteria to the CCI, which may simply add compliance burden. And I think generally when we look at the history of regulation in India, I think the 1991 reforms have just been fairly clear in terms of what deregulation can simply do for us as an economy. So given that IT and digital services is one bright spot in the Indian economy, what opportunity cost are we willing to bear to catch the really big ones is a question that is unique to India, and one that we should think on first principles from. And perhaps there is no merit in borrowing that thinking from what EU is doing, or UK is doing, or US is doing.
Got it.
And the other kind of side of this is, the harder that we make it for companies to set up shop here, the less likely they are to come, right? There's a very real possibility that the Googles and Amazons of the world are hey, you know what? I'm better off elsewhere. Right?
So that's a very interesting question, because one of the critical sort of things that that determines success of these companies is also the amount of data that they sort of collect
Yeah.
and have. So and one of the very interesting debates currently in antitrust also is that sure, consumers are not paying like a monetary price to access a Google, but we're surely paying through our data, right? So how do we really account for that as a price? Now, what's great for India is that we are so many people that it's if I were trying to collect and store
Mine
data,
data.
yeah, I would do it in India, right? So
This is the place to be.
Yeah, this is the place to be. So yeah, so India definitely has a population advantage going for it, but we've also historically, not been very good enforcers of the laws that we sort of put out, and that's and again another problem because of the state capacity thing we talked about in the beginning, right? So Land Pritchett very famously describes India as a flailing state, in that we are simultaneously too big and too large at too big and too small at the same time, in that we want to regulate everything, we want to govern everything, but our capacity is tiny, it's so tiny that we have to prioritize, right?
Yeah.
So my worry is that while this may be paved with great intentions, the enforcement of it is what's going to really decide whether it's going to add the sort of compliance burdens that will scare off some people that are investing in the bright spots of our economy, and only time can tell that. But yes, I just generally hope that the draft digital competition bill goes through many more rounds of public discourse and public debate, so that we're sharpening it to be very, very specifically targeted at the ones that we want to target. The flip side of over-regulation here might be a little too costly for the way Indian digital economy is positioned at the moment.
Okay, Manju, last question. Talking about public discourse right now, I mean, this is why we have this episode right now, is because the public sentiment is very anti-big tech right now, right? Do you think we're being fair and balanced when we're thinking of like these big tech companies as like the big bad wolf?
That's a very interesting question, again, because there is no one answer to something like this. And whenever we look at big tech, I think it's important to look at the kind of power that big tech as a whole, has had on the way it has changed from everything from what we eat to what we wear to how we commute to even how we vote, right? Like Cambridge Analytica was a huge example of how big tech power can easily be misused. Exactly. So I'm not saying that there are no instances of misuse, but I think it's important that we weigh these instances of misuse against what really big tech brings in terms of advantages to the Indian economy. So let's take COVID, for example, right?
Exactly.
Like the kind of delivery support system that some of these commerce companies were able to establish was phenomenal. And the fact that someone like an Amazon today gives a rural entrepreneur access to India as a whole as a market, as opposed to just maybe their limited local mandi. It's insane. The kind of connectivity that a YouTube or like even Google has established in rural places is also absolutely insane. And these are some essential functions that I don't think we can put a price on. These really mean a lot to the Indian economy. So I think when we're talking about big tech, yes, am I saying that there are no problems with it at all? Not at all. Everything comes with its own set of problems. But I think it's really important that we ask ourselves at this point in time, what is the opportunity cost of going down really heavy on these big tech companies? Do we stand more to lose or more to gain? And that should perhaps that is a goal that we have to define for ourselves as India, and then figure out how do we target our regulation or even antitrust laws to meet exactly those specified goals. So it should be a systems thinking approach and not really looking at antitrust and big tech in isolation. We need to look at the larger, bigger picture, zoom out and see what we can do with antitrust as just simply one other tool in the larger regulation, the larger regulation kitty that we have when we look at big tech.
Daybreak is produced from the newsroom of The Ken, India's first subscriber-focused business news platform. What you're listening to is just a small sample of our subscriber-only offerings.
A full subscription unlocks daily long-form feature stories, newsletters, and podcast extras. Head to theken.com and click on the red subscribe button on the top of the Ken website.
Today's episode was hosted and produced by Rahel Philippos and I, Snigdha Sharma, and it was edited by Rajiv CN. Also, a huge shout out to Aditi and Kavipriya and the rest of our fantastic design team here at the Ken for the amazing artwork that they make for every Friday special episode of Daybreak.